Min Jingpei, welcome back to our program.
Thank you.
So you've written a lot recently, particularly in advance of this latest round of talks between the Chinese and American negotiators. What did you make of how it ended? I mean, we sort of know that nothing big came out of it, but any incrementals that you could detect?
Not much. I don't think the Chinese are in a hurry to conclude a deal with Trump for a variety of reasons. And in fact, I think the window of closing a deal is rapidly closing if the negotiations drag beyond this year. Next year will be presidential election, so I just don't see any deal can be done in an election year.
So let me just play this soundbite by President Trump in which he talks about the dragging out of these trade talks from China's perspective.
China would love to wait and just hope. They hope it's not going to happen, I hope. But they would just love if I got defeated. So they could deal with somebody like Elizabeth Warren or Sleepy Joe Biden or any of these people. Because then they'd be allowed and able to continue to rip off our country like they've been doing for the last 30 years.
Analyze that for us. I mean, there is no doubt that China has been treated very, very well by the West for many, many decades now. Do you think that that is what they're angling for? Wait and see who wins the next election?
Well, I would say it's a little bit more sophisticated than what how Trump put it. A Democrat can be better or can be worse than Trump. But from the Chinese point of view, nobody can be worse than Trump in terms of trying to negotiate a deal with. Because Trump, throughout this process, has shown a propensity to change his terms and also in dealing with China, you have to be very conscious about not humiliating them in public. And Trump has been doing this all the time, and which really has upset them. But I think fundamentally, the Chinese have concluded that the deal with the U.S. at this point has lost a lot of its value. The heart of a trade deal is about supply chains. Because of the trade war, the expectations that these two countries can have a stable economic relationship have been shattered, really. And regardless of a deal or not, supply chain will move out of China. And the Chinese believe that they may end up much worse off if they do not stick to their own terms.
And yet, on the other side, look, the IMF has just basically downgraded Chinese growth and upgraded U.S. growth. Isn't there a case to be made that actually the United States would like to drag on these talks because actually it is hurting the Chinese economy more than it's hurting the U.S. economy? Let's not talk about American consumers who are paying for this tax. We know that the farmers are getting a $16 billion payout because they're hurting, and China's already going elsewhere to get soybeans and other things. But in general, isn't President Trump's strategy here proving to be, at least in zero-sum term games, correct?
Yeah, I don't think President Trump himself has a real strategy, but his geopolitical advisors do have a very sophisticated strategy. Their strategy is to, through the tariff war, get the supply chain out of China and fundamentally weaken China's economic growth. This strategy probably will work in the long term. In the short term, growth can be driven by a variety of factors. In the case of the US, probably I would say deficit spending, tax cut plays a much more important role than trade war with China in delivering some kind of positive growth numbers.
So as you...
And Chinese growth, yes, sorry. China's growth is dragged down not really by the trade war. Trade war plays a part. China's growth is really dragged down by its very high level of debt and its growth model, which is based on investments.
Okay, so I spoke just earlier this week. We had a rare conversation with Peter Navarro, who's the president's sort of trade guru. And this is what he said about the bigger picture in terms of this battle, as you've termed it, this new Cold War between the United States and China.
This is not a trade deal in the traditional sense where one country lowers tariffs and the other country lowers some tariffs. The problem we have with China is structural. China engages in various forms of economic aggression.
How do you respond to that? Do you agree with various forms of economic aggression and the idea that a structural issue needs to be resolved?
Well, I don't like the term economic aggression, but I do believe that the two economies have very different systems. And what we're seeing today, the problems between the two countries are really the problems between the two economic systems. And the heart of that really has to be the change of China's economic system. But the Chinese government has decided not to go down that path. And as long as that remains the case, the two economies will continue to have very serious economic frictions and tensions.
So, Min Ching-pei, you have also written that it's not just about trade. I mean, you have basically said that you believe the heart of the Trump administration's confrontation with China is to undermine and weaken China as a strategic rival. It's not just about economics and trade. It's about the entire, relative power of these two economic superpowers. Flesh that out for me.
Yeah, I'm afraid that is the case because the U.S. has had trade frictions with many of its allies, other countries in the world. You really have not seen the kind of toughness, the kind of rhetoric, the kind of determination with which this trade war with China has been waged. And the heart is really about our concerns about China's rise, China's role in the world, and the prospect that China could be one day a hegemon threatening American core interests.
Again, I think this is what Peter Navarro thinks, and he tried to push back on me when I was talking to him, and he asked me a question. Just listen to this.
Can I ask you a question?
If you like, but this isn't really you asking me questions. I'm interviewing you.
Just one question. Do you agree with the premise now that China and its economic model provides a negative effect on the global economy?
So he's asking me to comment on that. I mean, I'm not positioned to do that, so I'm going to ask you to comment on it.
Well, I think empirically that's completely untrue because China's economic growth has been a huge driver of global growth because China plays a central role in taking raw materials from other countries and process raw materials plus advanced components from developed countries and then sell them to other countries. So China is part of the global supply chain. I think what we should worry about China is something the Chinese government has hyped itself. China tries to use its own economics development success to show to the world that capitalism works, state capitalism works. So its model has some kind of ideological appeal, even though anybody who studies China would know that China's state capitalist model is highly inefficient. What makes the Chinese system work is the entrepreneurship of the Chinese people, China's business people, and China's connections with the outside world.
So that's interesting you should say that, because I guess one of the centers of entrepreneur, I mean, there are many in China, but Shanghai is one, obviously. And, I've heard told that many young entrepreneurs there are kind of sitting back and saying, yeah, this is the first time that an American president or a Western leader has pushed back and has put China on notice and, is saying, enough already. You guys have been treated with kid gloves for the last 4 decades. I mean, there is a little bit of sort of admiration amongst a certain group of people to this pushing back against this monolithic, massively growing, strategic rival that is China.
Oh, yes. I think within China, the private sector business people are actually rooting for the trade war because they want the trade war to open up China's economy, not just to the outside world, but more importantly, to domestic entrepreneurs. Because the biggest victims of China's state capitalist system is not really China's trading partners, of course, they are victimized by unfair trading practices or poor protection of IP. The real victims are China's private entrepreneurs because they have no property rights. They constantly face discrimination. They do not have dependable access to financing. So if the playing level field can be created as a result of the trade war, the biggest beneficiaries are actually going to be Chinese private entrepreneurs rather than American corporations.
So
even though American corporations will benefit.
So we've got a couple of minutes left. I want to do sort of a rapid fire round which goes beyond the economy. Because you study China a lot, I just want to ask you, what do you think is going to happen in Hong Kong? The Chinese have so far showed no inclination to intervene militarily or any which way. How long are they going to tolerate this?
I think they're probably going to wait 2 more months because China has a very important anniversary, October 1st, which is the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic coming up. They have a serious, extravagant festivities planned. They don't want to ruin that celebration. After that, they will just wait and see whether protests continue to escalate or whether protests get out of control.
And regarding the Uyghurs, you know that there's been a lot of criticism from the United States and around the world of the alleged internment of perhaps more than 1 million Uyghurs, the Muslim minority in China, into re-education camps. We've done a lot of reporting on it, and it's quite a dramatic situation. There are reports, I don't know whether you know about this, that Chinese say most of the interned have now been released. Can we trust this? Do you think that's happened?
I think anything from the Chinese government you've got to take with a huge grain, if not a ton of salt. I think the best thing for the Chinese government to do in this particular instance is to allow open inspection, welcome third-party, independent, credible parties to go into Xinjiang and to see those camps and see whether people have actually been released.
All right, Min Jingpei, always good to have you on with that perspective. Thanks so much for joining us.